that was given to us in the Constitution and shift more power to the administrative branch of government. Do you honestly believe that the Founding Fathers would recognize what they built in the Constitution?
Gentleman's time has expired.
Do you really think that they would look at the administrative branch of government and said, we wanted this kind of presidency and a weak legislative branch? I don't think so.
Expired.
This is a bad bill. I would vote it down if I were you.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized. The gentleman from Maryland has 4.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill is an important bipartisan measure. It has bipartisan support here in the House. It has strong bipartisan support in the Senate, where it's introduced by Senator Carper and Senator McCain and has strong bipartisan co-sponsorship. It's supported by the Obama administration. But Mr. Simpson's absolutely right. It's not the bipartisanship that makes this bill the right thing to do. It's the fact that it calls for greater transparency and greater accountability in our process. Everybody in this body has to concede that we can improve our budget process. Yes, we should work on the tax expenditure component. Yes, we should work on mandatory spending. Of course we should. But this is a simple bipartisan measure we can take to provide more transparency when it comes to over $1 trillion in discretionary spending. And I go back to where I started. Just look at this bill. 1,200+ pages. This House took less than 15 hours, to review this bill. Now, given the fact that we didn't have adequate time to scrutinize this, I don't see anything wrong with saying that if the President of the United States, Republican or Democrat, identifies some savings we can make for the taxpayer that go to deficit reduction, that this Congress should have to vote on that. Don't have to say yes. You just have to vote, up or down. And for those who argue otherwise, I have to say that I don't think putting turf over the taxpayer is a winning argument when it comes to dealing with our budget issues. Because, make no mistake, this is constitutional. It's been designed to be constitutional. Mr. Young said I said it wasn't relevant it's constitutional. That's not what I said. It's totally relevant that it's constitutional. And it's designed that way. Congress has the final say. That's what makes this constitutional. Are we giving the President a little more power? Well, only if you say that it's more power to recommend to Congress some savings for the taxpayer and that we will then vote on them. It seems to me that's just basic responsibility. Well over a majority of governors have total line item authority. This is not line item authority because it requires congressional vote and oversight. So I would say that the process is broken. It's not broken because of the Appropriations Committee. They do incredible hard work and put in lots of hours. But at the end of the day, we just saw last December, less than 15 hours to review 1,200 pages of appropriations bills. Who in this body can say that they looked at everything, they scrutinized everything, that we can't find any additional savings for the taxpayer for the purpose of deficit reduction? So I ask my colleagues to support this bill, not because it's bipartisan, but it is, and I think that's an important reflection on the fact that people on both sides of the aisle, bringing their own independent judgment to bear on this, have concluded this would be in the best interest of the country. But in addition to that, because it does take one measured, responsible step toward improving a broken budget process. And my goodness, at the end of the day, that would be a good day's work in a bipartisan Congress if we could get that done. I thank again the chairman of the committee, Mr. Ryan. I thank his staff and our staff, the Democratic staff on the committee, for working together. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time. I give back the balance.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 4 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the remainder of our time. Let me first of all say, the gentleman left the floor, I believe, but Mr. Simpson, I want to thank him for a civil and spirited debate. This is not an attempt to go after one committee, the Appropriations Committee. And I understand that this committee might feel that way. This is an attempt to take one more step on behalf of the taxpayer to clean up the system on how we spend hardworking taxpayers' dollars. Here's the issue, Mr. Chairman. When we pass large spending bills, we vote on things we're not even necessarily sure we're voting on. And I think the measure of success of this reform will not be measured by how many individual spending line items get voted out of spending by Congress, but how many items don't get put in these bills in the first place. Because this brings through to the final part of the process that extra level of transparency and accountability that has been lacking. I'll take a provision authored by a Republican a few years ago as an example. $40 million, I think that's the number, for a rainforest museum in Iowa, in a spending bill for labor and health that didn't go through the House, didn't go through the Senate, but came at the last minute. And yes, this Congress, through the rules of this House, is banning earmarks and airdrops, but who's to say they won't return under a new management someday? I think it would be helpful to the process to say, you know what? If we're going to put $40 million for a rainforest museum without real consideration before the House and the Senate, we ought to think about that individually. Or, more importantly, if I'm a member of Congress and I want to put something like this in a spending bill, I ought to think twice about whether or not I'm willing to defend this kind of spending in the light of day on an individual vote among my peers, because that could happen under this reform. This is constitutional because the President signs this spending bill. He doesn't sign part of it. He doesn't rescind part of it. He signs it, and then this gives him the ability to create a new bill saying, vote on this piece of spending. And we have expedited procedures, so we have to take the vote. It's no different than how presidents send us trade agreements to vote on under expedited procedures. We're not saying the president can take a part of a bill and not sign it and then send us this. No, 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 no. We're saying the president signs a big spending bill, and then, if he wants, he can write a new bill within a tight time window saying, cancel that spending. And then Congress makes the decision. The House and the Senate, by a simple majority vote, both houses, they get to decide whether or not to reaffirm or to spend that money. All this does is it puts the taxpayer in front of turf, as my friend from Maryland says, and it gives members of Congress the ability to have that extra layer of accountability and transparency so that at the end of the day, we are always thinking of the taxpayer first and special interests second in the way we spend taxpayer dollars. Will this fix all of our problems? No. But this, along with many other reforms we seek to bring to the floor, will hopefully turn the process by which we spend taxpayer dollars into one that is more accountable, more transparent, and more responsible. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendments recommended by the committees on the budget and rules printed in the bill, it shall be in order to consider as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 112-12. That amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered read. All points of order against that amendment in the nature of a substitute are waived. No amendment to that amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in House Report 112-389. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider amendment number 1, printed in the House Report 112-389. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in House Report number 112-389, offered by Mr. Ryan of Wisconsin.
Pursuant to House Resolution 540, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Ryan, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think we need to spend the entire amount of time on this. This amendment makes technical revisions to certain procedures and definitions. The time period was reduced from 5 legislative days to 3 legislative days for the introduction of an approval bill and the motion to proceed. The amendment clarifies that approval bills are described as discretionary only. Additionally, it includes a procedure that provides for the consideration of an approval bill should the previous Congress end before an up or down vote. All this simply does, Mr. Chairman, is clarify concerns raised by the Rules Committee so that we have consistent procedures, and concerns by the minority that this bill simply does what it says it does and that it's circumscribed to discretionary spending. With that, I really have no other things to say other than I'd be happy to yield at such time as he may consume to the gentleman from Maryland.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have nothing to add to that and would urge adoption of the amendment.
I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 2, printed in the House Report 112-389. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in House Report number 112-389, offered by Mr. Alexander of Louisiana.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 540, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Alexander, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as we decide whether or not the President of the United States should have the authority to propose cuts to funding that Congress appropriates money to, I cannot help but be gravely concerned about how he may use those powers. While I, as much as anyone here, agrees that our government must constrain and cut unnecessary expenditures, I fear that giving the President certain powers to take away that which Congress has given would severely harm certain states and regions whose needs the President may not fully understand. Of particular concern to me, Mr. Chairman, is the importance of the water resources, the projects across this country that are vitally important to our national security and economy. With this in mind, I believe that a line must be drawn when it comes to the President's authority to propose a rescission to the budget of the Army Corps of Engineers, an agency that's older than our nation itself. Corps of Engineers helped General Washington win the Revolutionary War. The Corps of Engineers carries out water resource projects throughout the United States, including projects that protect citizens from flood hazards and keep commercial waterways navigable. These projects are important. They're important to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. The congressional appropriations for the Corps typically exceed what the President's requests have been. I believe that we must prevent any President, Republican or Democrat, from having the authority to reduce funding for critical water resource projects. It is just too important to this nation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does any member like to claim time in opposition?
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I won't take all my time. The gentleman is right that the Army Corps clearly provides an extremely important function, very valid federal function to our government, to our country. I rise in opposition only that we shouldn't be carving out exceptions. The idea that we'll carve out an exception from appropriation bills for expedited rescission consideration to one government agency versus all the other government agencies out there, I just don't think that's a good precedent to set. What's to say that other agencies shouldn't be exempted from consideration? If Congress feels that these are important projects, which they clearly do when they pass these bills, then clearly they will affirm that if another vote ever does arise. For the sake of consistency, for the sake of treating all agencies equal, I would urge rejection of this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those in favor of taking this vote by a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
The House is voting on an amendment to the line item veto bill. The overall legislation would allow the President within 45 days of signing a spending bill to propose spending cuts in that law. The President would be allowed to submit up to 2 packages of proposed cuts for each spending bill, and Congress would have to consider them under expedited floor procedures. We spoke with a reporter about that legislation.
Paul Kralzak is with Congressional Quarterly. Your story in today's CQ points out that the line item veto bill has split members of both parties. How so and why?
Well, the appropriators in general, both in the Senate and the House, and both Republican and Democratic appropriators, most of them have been opposed to the idea of a line item veto for a long time because they argue that it takes power away from the legislative branch and gives it to the executive branch, and so they have pushed against it.
Well, why would, in the case of this bill, why would lawmakers be willing to give now the President the line item veto power?
Well, the idea is that this would help to save money and reduce the deficit. The bill would allow the President, after an appropriations bill has been passed, to say, okay, I would like to, cut these items out of the appropriations bill. The President sends a message to Congress, says, I would like to cut this out, and then then Congress is required to either, approve those deletions or reject those deletions. So the reason this is coming up is there was a line item veto bill passed in the 90s, and it was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And the main reason it was ruled unconstitutional is because the President could veto items, delete items, but Congress was not required to act on that. Those deletions would stand unless Congress chose to vote and reject them. With this bill, Congress has to act one way or the other. So there's a belief that this will be constitutional, and Congress is not giving up as much power under this bill.
So under this bill, Congress has to vote one way or the other, up or down, approve or not approve the President's veto.
Exactly.
What about the prospects of the bill, assuming it passes the House today? What are the prospects ahead in the Senate?
Very uncertain in the Senate. There is quite a bit of support for the bill in the Senate. Well, there's a similar bill in the Senate, and that has, I think, something like, 50 sponsors or so, and including, I think, about 16 Democrats. So there is support for the idea in the Senate, but Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid is thought to oppose the idea of a line item veto, and it's considered unlikely that he would allow a vote on such a bill. But it's still possible that a line item veto could be introduced as an amendment to another bill.
And is this the type of thing that the Obama administration has been calling for?
As a matter of fact, yes, and the President has endorsed this House bill and encouraged its passage. So the White House is supporting it.
You also write about the issue of prohibiting earmarks. How does that tie into the line item issue?
Well, both when we talk about eliminating earmarks, prohibiting earmarks, and also giving the President the authority to delete spending items. These are ways to reduce spending in a very targeted way, looking at certain items and getting rid of them or prohibiting that kind of spending from taking place. So it's part of a larger effort to reduce what some consider to be unnecessary spending.
An update from Paul Krausak with Congressional Quarterly. Read more at CQ.com. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
The amendment that the House is voting on now would prohibit the President from proposing expedited funding cuts for the Army Corps of Engineers as part of a line-item veto proposal. On the House floor today, Speaker John Boehner vowed to repeal an Obama administration regulation requiring employers, including religious organizations, to provide birth control coverage in their employees' health care plans. Here's Speaker Boehner on the floor.
My colleagues, in recent days, Americans of every faith and political persuasion have mobilized in objection to a rule put forward by the Obama administration that constitutes an unambiguous attack on religious freedom in our country. This rule would require faith-based employers, including Catholic charities, schools, universities, and hospitals, to provide services they believe are immoral. Those services include sterilization, abortion-inducing drugs, devices, and contraception. In imposing this requirement, the federal government has drifted dangerously beyond its constitutional boundaries, encroaching on religious freedom in a manner that affects millions of Americans and harms some of our nation's most vital institutions. If the President does not reverse the Department's attack on religious freedom, then the Congress, acting on behalf of the American people and the Constitution that we're sworn to uphold and defend, must. The House will approach this matter fairly and deliberately through regular order and appropriate legislative channels. Because it has primary jurisdiction on the issues involved, the Energy and Commerce Committee is taking the lead on the legislative process that will be necessary to enact an effective and appropriate solution. Chairman Upton convened a hearing late last year and began laying the groundwork for legislative action when this flawed rule was first proposed. And I welcome his efforts to consider all possible options as his committee proceeds with its efforts. This attack by the federal government on religious freedom in our country must not stand and will not stand.
Senate Democrats, including Senators Blumenthal, Boxer, Murray, Lautenberg, and Gillibrand, are holding a press conference about that contraception rule. That's at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, about 25 minutes from now. We'll have that live on C-SPAN 2. Earlier today, Senate Republicans weighed in on that issue.
Kind of a slow day today. With all the newsmakers somewhere else. They're out at the baseball park, I heard. Is that right? They're at the Nats stadium. We had a Republican conference this morning to discuss essentially the jobs issue and our economy and the way forward. Our new conference chairman, John Thune, convened that issue, but we also convened the meeting, and I'm going to call on him in a minute, and then we'd like to address another issue that's arisen in the context of Obamacare. We know it got the government involved in all aspects of our health care, but amazingly enough, it's gotten involved in other things as well. And we have three senators with us, Senator Ayotte, Blunt, and Rubio, who've been involved in developing a response to the most recent discovery of yet another government interference with our lives in Obamacare. So we'll turn to that shortly, but with that, let me call on our conference chair, John Thune.
Thank you, Leader. We did have a really good discussion this morning, and the one thing you're always reminded of whenever you get a bunch of Republican senators together is that we are very much an entrepreneurial party. We don't march in lockstep. We have lots of people with really good ideas about how to move our country forward. The one thing that I think I would say and that everybody agrees on, and that is that the President's policies have made our economy much, much worse. And because his policies have made our economy worse, he is trying to distract and from that record and divide Americans and talking about envy and division and all those sorts of things to get groups of Americans pitted against each other. We think there's a better way. We think that we ought to be talking not about how we can redistribute the pie, but how we can make it bigger for all Americans, how we can expand and grow our economy and create jobs. And so this morning it was really about us trying to come together around some of those key agenda items and hopefully to be able to work with the Democrats on that, although it looks very much like they don't want to do a lot this year. I think that the leader on their side would like to insulate his members from having to make difficult votes in an election year. It's pretty clear we're not going to be having a budget this year, which of course is the blueprint, if you will, the path forward in terms of how we're going to deal with spending and debt and jobs in the economy. So, you know, we're at a loss right now as to why the Democrats are not going to produce a budget for now what would be the fourth year in a row. But I hope that there are some things that we can get done between now and the election. The American people expect us to act. We don't have the luxury of time. The issues that we face are big, and the consequences of inaction are great. So my hope would be that we will see some willingness on their part to work with us to put policies in place that will actually make it less expensive and less difficult to create jobs for small businesses in this country rather than making it more expensive and more difficult, which is what we've seen with the Obama agenda and now the record and the economy that they have handed us. As the leader said, we have some folks who have been very much in the lead on this issue of religious liberty. It's pretty clear that we have in this country a heritage. We have the people who founded this country left other parts of the world because of the issue of religious persecution, and that is an incredible distinctive about America, and they don't have that. Religious liberty is not something that's known in many parts of the world, and certainly not in places like the Middle East. And what we have seen with this administration now is the trampling of that First Amendment protection and a systematic dismantling of religious liberty for people in this country. And so we believe that the President and hopefully his administration will walk back from this, but clearly this is an issue that has gotten the attention not only of people who would subscribe to various religions in this country, Catholics, Protestants, but those who perhaps maybe aren't even all that religious simply because they see this as another attempt to grow government, to make it bigger and more expansive and more intrusive in their lives. And that is one of the very things that we warned about when Obamacare was adopted in the first place. But I'd like to introduce one of my colleagues, and then I think she's going to hand it off to Senators Rubio and Blunt, but Kelly Ayotte.
Thank you. We have seen with the President's health care bill and the regulations recently issued by Health and Human Services an unprecedented affront to religious liberty. And if we put religious institutions and faith-based organizations in the position where they have to comply with government mandates that violate the principles of their faith, it violates our First Amendment to the Constitution, and really it's an affront to what we stand for as Americans. I'll say this is not a women's rights issue. This is a religious liberty issue, and it can apply to all faiths. And I've heard from my constituents who are deeply, deeply concerned about this. We need to respect the rights of conscience for all religions. And when you look at what this administration has done, really it's awoken a whole group of people that are deeply, deeply concerned about an unprecedented extension of government into issues that we have always left in the quiet of people's homes, in their churches, and in faith-based institutions. And I'll say this also, what the administration has done is really unprecedented in terms of both parties have respected religious liberty. If you look at what was signed into law in 1993, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, what this administration has done also violates not only the spirit of that law, but also the letter of that law, which was signed into law by a Democratic president. So again, I would say this is unprecedented. This is not a women's rights issue. This is a right that goes to the fundamental of our First Amendment in the Constitution. I would call on the President to overturn these Health and Human Services regulations, to stop infringing on religious freedom, and to really change the direction of what we have seen with the unprecedented expansion that we've seen from Obamacare. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kelly. What you really have here is the administration now this week trying to act like they're backing away from this bad policy. Jay Carney saying, well, we want to talk about this for a year. We've given them a year to think about it. That may actually be almost the most offensive part of this whole idea, that you tell religious institutions you have to do things that are contrary to your faith principles. And by the way, we're going to give you a year to figure out how to accommodate that change in your faith principles. It's offensive. It violates the First Amendment of the Constitution. It shows what happens when the government begins to think that they can not only define health care but deliver health care. It should not be allowed to stand, and it's just fundamentally a religious principle issue. You know, this is where the government's saying, here's the kind of coverage, the specific kind of coverage you have to give your employees. This particular rule is not even about health care at institutions or anything else. It's about the coverage you have to give your employees. There was just recently a Supreme Court case, 9-0, on hiring at religious institutions. And others at the White House will say, well, we give the church an exemption, which frankly shows how little they understand the whole faith-based institutions of the country. The church extends well beyond the building of the church. If it's a church-run school, if it's a church-run university, if it's a daycare center, if it's a Jewish daycare center or a Muslim community outreach effort, all of those things are part of that faith-based community. And the Supreme Court just ruled 9-0 in an academy case, Hosanna Tabor versus the EEOC, 9-0, that those institutions have specific, different, and protected hiring rights. They also have all kinds of other different, specific, and protected rights because of who they are and because of the Constitution. And you cannot pass laws and rules that violate constitutional principles. That's what this would do. That's why there's been such outrage about it. And it's only one of many instances that could occur if you begin to think that the government can interfere in these areas. And it's about religious liberty. It's not about a specific individual application of that liberty. It's about religious liberty. And so we want to look at things like the rights of conscience, which were mentioned, I'm told, at the Constitutional Convention itself as one of the reasons for the First Amendment. And I understand people's outrage and would join many in the Congress, Democrats and I believe Republicans, and I believe soon there'll be a number of Democrats saying to the administration, don't go down this foolish path. Don't try to turn America into something it's not, and don't think that you can run, that the government controls the faith views of the American people. Marco?
This has nothing to do with contraception. It doesn't even have anything to do with right versus left or liberal versus conservative. This is very straightforward. This is about whether the government of the United States should have the power to go in and tell a faith-based organization that they have to pay for something that they teach their members shouldn't be doing. It's that simple. And if the answer is yes, then we can read then this government can reach all kinds of other absurd results. I think the vast majority of Americans, whether they're on the left or the right, would tell you that the government of the United States should not have the power to be able to go in and tell a church-based organization that they must pay for something that that faith teaches their members not to do. And that's what this issue is about. And that's why you have commentators on both the left and the right saying that this was wrong. That's why I think you have people in the White House uncomfortable with it. So here's the solution in my mind. The solution is for the President to come back and say, you know what, maybe we overreached, maybe we went too far, we've heard from a lot of people, and we're going to reconsider this decision. There's nothing wrong with that. We have plenty of other issues to argue with this President about. We have plenty of other issues to take to the American people throughout the year and in the November elections. This doesn't have to be one of them. And all the President has to do is basically reconsider the decision they've made and acknowledge that maybe they went too far and maybe they didn't think about it all the way when they made it. And I hope that that's what will happen. If it doesn't, then I hope that this Senate and that House will act on it as well, because the American people are asking us to, and I think that's an important issue. I see. Do you want it in Spanish? ¿Lo quieres en español? Básicamente esto no se trata de anticonceptivos. Al contrario, esto se trata de derechos constitucionales. El tema es muy simple. El gobierno de los Estados Unidos debe tener el poder de requerir que una iglesia tenga que pagar por algo que esa iglesia enseña que no deben estar haciendo sus miembros. Porque si el gobierno tiene el poder de hacer eso, estamos viviendo en un país muy peligroso. Estos son derechos básicos que se encuentran en nuestra Constitución, son derechos que nos distinguen en comparación a otros países del mundo, y por eso es tan importante que este tema se resuelva. Yo creo que la solución es que el presidente Obama lo reconsidere, que admita que ha cometido un error y cambie de mente. Aquí nadie lo va a criticar por eso. Existen miles de otros temas que podemos debatir y miles de otros temas que podemos llevar al público americano en noviembre. Este no debe ser uno de ellos. Y por eso que vemos en la izquierda y la derecha, demócratas y republicanos, un número creciente de personas involucradas en la política de este país criticando esta decisión porque es incorrecta. Viola la Constitución de los Estados Unidos y el presidente debe reconsiderar. Y si no lo hace, el Congreso debe actuar. Gracias.
Senator Thune. Mark will take question. You said that this is part of a systematic dismantling of religious liberty in this country. Can you give us the basis for that statement?
Well, I just think that, I guess what I'm suggesting is, I've looked at what this administration is doing with regard to our economy. It's pretty clear to me that the growth and expansion that we've seen in government is leading us toward more of a social welfare state that you would see in a European country. And I think decisions like this are also decisions that move us more in the direction of the secularization of our country and seem to me to suggest a disregard for the basic core beliefs of a lot of the American people. And I think that religious liberty is something that people have fought for over the years, and as I said, it's something that brought people to this country in the first place. And it ought to be the thing that we are most concerned about every aspect of our Constitution. But if we're not willing to defend our constitutional rights and the things for which people came to this country in the first place, and many have fought and died, then you know, I don't know what kind of a country we are. But this is an affront to the Constitution and to the issue of religious liberty, in my view.
Could I also add, I want to give an example of something that happened earlier this year. The Conference of Catholic Bishops applied for the sex trafficking grant. They had previously held the grant, and the administration, basically the career employees at Health and Human Services gave the Conference of Catholic Bishops the highest ranking because of their prior performance in addressing the issue of sex trafficking. And the administration went as far, the political appointees, of changing the criteria of the grant to make sure that that faith-based organization who objectively got the highest ranking would not receive it. So when I see something like that, I think to myself, that is something that's deeply troubling, because objectively they deserve to get that grant. I've questioned it, I know others have here, but that's another example where I think that the administration overreached.
But if you listen to their compromise is we're going to talk to them in a year and figure out how they can comply with this rule. Go back and listen to exactly what they said yesterday, which was we gave them a year to see how they can comply with this rule. It wasn't a discussion of how we can change the rule. It wasn't a discussion of how we can walk away from this. The White House does not need to do this, and whether it's EEOC versus an academy, or the Catholic bishops not getting a grant, or hospitals being told if you don't provide all services, we won't reimburse you for any services. This is systematically happening across the board. This just happens to be something that struck so at the heart of these big institutions that provide lots of health care and lots of education that they're the ones that's driving this debate, not us. It was the Catholic bishops that sent the letter to every parishioner, I think, in America for the last 2 weeks. Or it's the Catholic chaplain of the Army, the head chaplain of the Army, that sent a letter that initially wasn't going to be read. This is a huge, huge issue, and if you listen to what they're saying, they're just trying to change the subject and kick it down the road a year, which may be why they gave it a year to start with.
Leader McConnell, could you speak briefly about the legislative response that you would be prepared to attempt to bring to the floor? I know that your senators have introduced two different bills, and I'm curious on sort of legislative response.
Well, the short answer is we're discussing the appropriate response, and the three senators you've heard from are involved in those discussions, and we'll let you know when we decide what approach we're going to take.
Senators, could any of you support the President, someone who either signed a requirement that religious affiliated institutions provide this kind of care or failed to attack specific requirements?
Would you repeat that question?
Sure. Could you support the President, anyone who never signed into law a requirement that religious affiliated hospitals say provide emergency equipment? There's ample reporting out there that under Governor Romney, Massachusetts healthcare requirements, had included some of these requirements. I'm wondering.
I think there's, on that topic, there's also other reporting that he vetoed the bill, which was put in line over his veto. So that's not what this is about. This is about religious liberty, these institutions. You can try to turn it into all the political discussion you want. This is a First Amendment American right. It has nothing to do with who said that when or who said this. This is about this issue right now. And the conscience protection law that Senator Ayotte and Senator Rubio and I filed some time ago, that we all three co-sponsored, anticipated exactly the path that the administration was on. This just became the issue that has really brought public attention to something we've been trying to talk about for weeks now.
What is the future of military aid to Egypt? How did you answer that, based on your statement?
Well, I'm obviously very, very concerned about the Americans that are being held, and I issued a statement yesterday with Senator McCain and Senator Lieberman. Right now, I think the Egyptian government needs to understand how serious we are about resolving this issue, and certainly we're in a position where their aid could be in jeopardy. They have an opportunity to correct this by obviously releasing the Americans that are held and resolving this with our country. There's no question we have a very important relationship with Egypt, and I want to see that relationship repaired, but it's up to them to act right now.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. See you.
Thank you.
So as this vote wraps up, it's on a measure that would prohibit the President from proposing expedited funding cuts for the Army Corps of Engineers.
Does any member wish to change their vote?
Mr. Kissel. Off aye on no for Mr. Kissel. Mrs. Napolitano. Off no, on aye for Mrs. Napolitano. Mrs. McCarthy of New York. Off no, on aye for Mrs. McCarthy of New York.
On this vote, the yeas are 128, the nays are 300. The amendment is not adopted. The question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Accordingly, under the rule, the committee rises.
Mr. Chairman. The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration the bill H.R. 3521. And pursuant to the House Resolution 540, reports the bill back to the House with an amendment adopted in the Committee of the Whole. Under the rule, the previous question is ordered. Is a separate vote demanded on the amendment to the amended reported from the Committee of the Whole? If not, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it. Rating.
A bill to amend the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974 to provide for a legislative line item veto to expedite consideration of rescissions and for other purposes.
The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed will say no. The ayes have it. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
We ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
A vote on final passage of the line item veto bill that would allow the President, within 45 days of signing a spending bill, to propose spending cuts to that law. We heard during the last vote Senate Republicans talking about an Obama administration regulation requiring employers, including religious organizations, to provide birth control coverage to their employees' health plans. Coming up in about 4 p.m. Eastern Time, a couple minutes from now, Senate Democrats will hold a press conference about that contraception rule. We're going to have that live on C-SPAN 2. Our 3 days of live coverage of the Conservative Political Action Conference begins tomorrow with Texas Governor Rick Perry, House Speaker John Boehner, a former presidential candidate Herman Cain, and Senator Rand Paul. That starts at 1 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow on C-SPAN 3.
The yeas are 254, the nays are 173. The bill is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table.